which is the basis for the blessing of freedom which we have. That's the major premise. The minor premise is that all Christians are mandated to do whatever they do, including voting, to the glory of God. So all Christians are mandated to do whatever it is they do, whether it's a plumber, an electrician, somebody who's working in technology, whether it's a doctor, whether you're working with your hands or working with your brain, whether you are a mother, a housewife, a father, whatever it is that you're doing. We do everything to the glory of God, and all of our responsibilities within that we are to do to the glory of God to the very best of our ability. So here's our conclusion. All Christians who are citizens of the United States should vote wisely and intelligently to preserve and defend the Constitution, for this glorifies God. Okay, that's our conclusion. That all Christians have this as their responsibility. It's not just a responsibility to vote wisely and intelligently, but to do so within a biblical framework of doing it to the glory of God. Not just doing it because that's what you do as a citizen, but because you are a believer, you have a transcendent motive. Second rationale, major premise. The U.S. citizen, like the President of the U.S., is to preserve and protect the Constitution of the United States. This comes out of our first major premise in the previous rationale. The minor premise here is a little different. In order to preserve and protect the Constitution of the United States, we should understand the thinking which it embodies. If you're going to preserve and defend something, then you need to understand what it is, why it is the way it is, and you need to understand the threats that come against it. So, in order to preserve and protect the Constitution of the United States, we should understand the thinking which it embodies and the source of that thinking. Where did these ideas come from? Conclusion. Therefore, the United States citizen, in order to vote intelligently and wisely, must understand the thinking embodied in the U.S. Constitution so that he can vote in a way that preserves and protects our heritage. We're not going to overthrow the Constitution. By the way, the U.S. Constitution has been in effect for about 218 years or 19 years, I forget the exact date, but longer than in that time France has had 4 or 5 governments, and Russia's had 4 governments since the early part of the 20th century, and many other nations have had many other forms of government. I can't count how high in terms of how many governments the Mexicans have had in that length of time. It's one of those high numbers that they talk about in Revelation. But what is it that gave this sort of stability to our government? And I am arguing that it's because it derived its fundamental principles out of the Word of God. Third rationale. The thought system which is embodied in the founding documents of this nation derives from Christian theism broadly and the Bible specifically. And I began to show that on Sunday morning at the end, and we will develop that even more this evening. The minor premise, which derives from the first rationale. All Christians who are citizens of the United States should vote wisely and intelligently to preserve and defend the Constitution, for this glorifies God. What's the conclusion? By understanding the biblical framework that lies behind the Constitution, a Christian can then vote more intelligently and wisely to preserve and protect the Constitution and the freedom it recognizes. If you are a postmodern or a secular humanist, or a modern atheist, and you go back and reinterpret the Constitution in light of your modernist views, then what you end up with is something that is completely divorced from what the Founding Fathers intended, because you are inventing this out of whole cloth. And that's what I talked about as well on Sunday morning, that the assumption that I'm bringing to this, that underlies this entire approach, is that in order to understand and interpret the Constitution, we have to understand its original historical context and the culture out of which it came in order to preserve and protect that. Interpretation depends upon proper historical, literal historical hermeneutic. And I use this chart. I said today we live in a world where there has been a battle. It developed out of the thought systems that came into existence in the 19th century. And instead of the view on the right, notice I constructed this so that the right view would be on the right and the left view would be on the left. The view that one interprets the Constitution in terms of its original intent, called originalists, or sometimes strict constructionists, textualists, or conservatives. And on the left, there's the loose constructionists, or revisionists, or liberals. And I was pleased to note that after Sunday, I had 5 or 6 people at least in the congregation email additional information to me that this last Thursday, which would have been, I believe, what would that have been? The 16th of October. The Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, in his Riston lecture to the Manhattan Institute, stated, let me put it this way. There are really only 2 ways to interpret the Constitution. Try to discern as best we can what the framers intended, or make it up. No matter how ingenious, imaginative, or artfully put, unless interpretive methodologies are tied to the original intent of the framers, they have no more basis in the Constitution than the latest football scores. To be sure, even the most conscientious effort to adhere to the original intent of the framers of our Constitution is flawed, as all methodologies and human institutions are. But at least originalism has the advantage of being legitimate and, I might add, impartial. Because you're dealing with original intent, it has a standard. There's objectivity. That's what the justice is saying. And so we have something we can all appeal to. And this was the role of judges and the role of the Supreme Court up until the early part of the 20th century. Because there was this huge culture shift, you've heard the terms culture wars, because there was this huge culture shift or worldview shift that occurred in the 19th century that was exhibited in naturalism, secular humanism. There was a shift away from, in the field of knowledge, from objectivity and certainty of knowledge, and a shift away from the biblical way of thinking that had characterized the Founding Fathers, had characterized the generations of the 17th and 18th centuries, and no longer characterized the majority of early 20th century Americans. And so this led to the gradual erosion of originalism and originalism and strict constructionism in the Constitution, and began to change our culture. Now, I pointed out that Bible-believing Christians believe that the Bible should be interpreted literally, and by extension, literal interpretation, which includes the author's original intent, is the way that all writings should be interpreted. Whether you're trying to interpret a Shakespearean sonnet, or you're trying to interpret the instructions to fill out your tax form, or to make it really relevant for many of us, trying to interpret the instructions from FEMA on how to fill out your forms to submit to FEMA in light of the recent hurricane, whatever it is, you're interpreting those documents in terms of authorial intent. You're saying, what do they mean by this? See, that's how we interpret things. When you just think back when you were 16 or 17 or 18 or 19, you got that first love note from a girl or a guy that you were interested in, and you looked at it and they said something, and you said, well, what do they mean by that? So you understood innately, because that's the way God made us, that to understand something, we have to understand what the author intends, and we can't read into it whatever we want to. We can't just make it up out of whole cloth. And that is exactly what has happened too often in the judiciary. And so, as I pointed out in the chart that we had up there a minute ago, is that we have two presidential candidates, McCain on the right. He's an inconsistent originalist, but he rejects judicial activism, at least theoretically. But on the left, we have Obama, who is a consistent revisionist, has voted against originalists every time he, on the two opportunities he had, serving as a U.S. Senator, and he affirms judicial activism.